They laughed when the lawyer said her name, when he said what her husband had left her, when the words broken trailer and one box echoed across the room like some kind of cruel joke. But what none of them realized, not the smirking stepchildren, not the impatient relatives, not even the lawyer who avoided eye contact, was that inside that forgotten trailer, hidden behind dust and silence, was something that would change everything they thought they knew about the man they had just buried, and about the woman they had just dismissed. Evelyn Carter sat perfectly still as the will was read, her hands folded neatly in her lap, her face calm in a way that almost looked like acceptance, though inside her chest something heavy was sinking, something she couldn't quite name yet. 38 years. That's how long she had been married to Harold Carter. 38 years of shared mornings, quiet dinners, sacrifices made without complaint, standing beside him when his business struggled, when the money was tight, when the nights stretched long with worry and doubt. She had believed, truly believed, that whatever they built together. But now, sitting in that cold office with polished wood and muted voices, it felt like she had been written out of her own life. The lake house will go to Daniel Carter. The lawyer read, his tone flat, professional. Daniel nodded slightly, already expecting it. The rental properties will be transferred to Lisa Carter. Lisa exhaled with satisfaction, her eyes briefly flicking toward Evelyn, not with sympathy, but something closer to dismissal. Investment accounts and liquid assets will be divided as outlined. The words blurred together after that, but Evelyn understood enough. Everything of value, everything substantial, everything that looked like a lifetime of success, it was all going to them. Not to her. Not to the woman who had stood beside Harold through every uncertain year. Then came the pause, the slight shift in tone that made everyone look up again. And to his wife, Evelyn Carter. The room quieted just a little. Even Lisa leaned forward. He leaves the trailer located on Route 9, along with one personal box stored inside. For a second, no one spoke. Then Lisa let out a short, sharp laugh before covering her mouth, as if she hadn't meant to let it slip. Daniel shook his head slowly, almost amused. A trailer, he murmured. That's something. Evelyn didn't react outwardly, but her mind caught on the word instantly. The trailer. She remembered it, vaguely. It had been years since Harold mentioned it, longer since he had gone there. It wasn't a place of value. It was a leftover, something old, something he once used and then forgot. At least, that's what she thought. The lawyer slid a small metal key across the table toward her, along with a folded document confirming the transfer. That concludes the will, he said quietly. And just like that, it was over. 38 years reduced to a key and a box no one else wanted. The meeting dissolved quickly after that. Chairs scraped back. Polite condolences were muttered without much feeling behind them, and within minutes the room was emptying. Daniel and Lisa didn't linger. They had things to discuss, assets to manage, plans to make. Evelyn overheard fragments as they stepped into the hallway. We should list the lake house by next month. And the rentals, we can refinance those. Not once did they look back at her. Not once did they ask if she was all right. Evelyn remained seated for a moment longer, staring at the key in her hand. It felt heavier than it should have. Cold. Final. Eventually, she stood, smoothing her coat as if the simple act could steady her, and walked out of the office into the pale afternoon light. The world outside moved on as if nothing had changed. Cars passing, people talking, the ordinary rhythm of a day that didn't care about what had just been taken from her. That night, she barely slept. The house, no, not even her house anymore, she realized, felt unfamiliar. Every room carried a quiet echo of Harold, but now those echoes felt distant, almost unreachable. She kept thinking about the trailer, about the box, about the way Harold had chosen those things specifically. It didn't make sense. He had never been careless with decisions, never random. So why this? Why leave her something that looked so meaningless? By morning, the question had settled into something sharper. Not confusion, not even hurt, curiosity, and maybe, just beneath that, a flicker of something else. She dressed quietly, took the key, and drove out toward Route 9. The road stretched long and empty, lined with dry grass and scattered trees, the kind of place people passed through without noticing. When she finally saw it, she almost drove past. The trailer sat off to the side, slightly tilted, its once white paint faded and peeling, one window cracked at the corner. It looked abandoned, forgotten. The steps creaked under her weight as she approached, and for a moment she hesitated, her hand hovering near the door. This was it. This was what he left her. Taking a slow breath, she unlocked it. The door opened with a low groan, as if it hadn't been touched in years. Inside, the air was stale, thick with dust. Light filtered through the cracked window, illuminating a space that felt smaller than she remembered. There was almost nothing there. A broken chair, an old bed frame with no mattress, a narrow table pushed against the wall, and on that table, a small wooden box. That was it. No note waiting on the door. No explanation written on the walls. Just the box. Evelyn stepped inside slowly, the floor creaking beneath her feet, her eyes fixed on it. "Is this really all?" she whispered, though there was no one to answer. The silence pressed in around her, heavy and absolute. For a moment, doubt crept in. Maybe this was exactly what it looked like. Maybe Harold had simply chosen not to leave her more. The thought stung sharper than she expected, but something in her resisted it. Something refused to believe that after everything, after all those years, this was the end of the story. She moved closer to the table, her hand trembling just slightly as she reached out. The box was worn, its surface scratched with age, but it was intact, carefully placed, as if it mattered more than anything else in the room. Slowly, almost cautiously, Evelyn lifted the lid. And in that quiet, forgotten trailer, everything began to change. The box didn't contain anything valuable in the way Evelyn Carter's stepchildren would have understood. No cash, no jewelry, nothing that looked like the kind of inheritance people fight over. But the moment she looked inside, she felt that same quiet, unsettling certainty that had followed her since the will was read, that her husband hadn't left her with nothing. He had left her with something she was meant to figure out. Inside was a folded piece of paper and a small metal key with a thin tag attached. Evelyn picked up the paper first, unfolding it carefully, expecting a letter, some kind of explanation, anything that would make sense of the humiliation she had just endured. But there was no message, at least, not in the way she expected. Just a list of numbers written neatly in Harold's handwriting. Coordinates, line after line of them. At the bottom, a single sentence. "You were the only one I trusted to understand." Evelyn read it twice, her brow tightening. Trusted her to understand what? This wasn't like him. Harold had never been vague or mysterious. He was practical, direct, a man who said what he meant. And yet here she was, standing in a broken trailer, holding a puzzle instead of answers. She set the paper down and picked up the key, turning it over in her fingers. It was heavier than it looked, solid, important. The tag attached to it had 3 engraved letters, SBH. She didn't recognize them, but something about them stayed with her, like a word she almost remembered. Evelyn looked around the empty trailer again. Dust, silence, nothing else. And slowly, the confusion began to shift into something else. Determination. If Harold had left her this, then it meant something. And she wasn't going to walk away without knowing what. The next morning, she followed the coordinates. The drive took her far beyond the familiar parts of town, past highways and quiet stretches of land she had never seen before, until eventually she found herself entering an industrial district. Orderly, quiet, almost too quiet. She slowed the car, scanning the buildings as she passed, until one name made her breath catch. Silver Bay Holdings. Her hand tightened around the key. SBH. For a moment, she just sat there, the engine running, her heart beating faster as the connection settled in. "No," she whispered, but she already knew. This was it. She stepped inside, where a man behind the desk looked up with a polite but guarded expression. "Can I help you?" he asked. Evelyn placed the paper and key in front of him. "My husband owned this," she said quietly. "Harold Carter." The man glanced at the items, then at her, and something in his demeanor shifted. He checked his system, then nodded slowly. "This unit has been under restricted access for over 20 years, he said. 20 years. The words hit harder than she expected. "I'm his wife," she replied. After a brief pause, he slid a form toward her. "Then it belongs to you now." Minutes later, Evelyn stood in front of a numbered storage unit at the end of a long, echoing corridor. For a second, she hesitated. Whatever Harold had hidden, whatever he hadn't told her all these years, it was behind this door. Taking a steady breath, she unlocked it. The door rolled open with a low metallic sound, and at first, it didn't seem like much, just another storage space. But as she stepped inside, her eyes adjusted, and everything changed. This wasn't clutter. It was organized, intentional. Filing cabinets lined one wall, each one locked. Crates were stacked neatly in the corners, sealed and labeled. Maps rested on a table, their edges worn, as if they had been studied over and over again. There were bank boxes, document cases, and at the back, a large steel safe that immediately drew her attention. Evelyn stood still, her mind racing as she opened the nearest cabinet. Documents filled it, property records, contracts, financial statements, all in Harold's name. Her breath caught as she flipped through them, her confusion turning into disbelief. These weren't recent. The dates went back years, to times when Harold had told her money was tight, when he said they had to be careful, when she believed they were barely getting by. And yet, here was proof that something else had been happening all along. Something he never told her. "Why didn't you say anything?" she whispered, her voice echoing softly in the stillness. Slowly, her gaze lifted across the room until it landed on the safe. Something about it felt final, like everything led to it. Evelyn reached into her pocket, pulled out the key from the box, and stepped forward, her heart steady but heavy, knowing that whatever truth Harold had left behind, it was waiting for her inside. The key turned more smoothly than Evelyn expected, the lock inside the steel safe clicking open with a quiet finality that seemed to echo through the entire unit. And for a moment, she just sat there, staring, as if some part of her wasn't ready for whatever waited inside. But she hadn't come this far to hesitate now. Slowly, she pulled the door open. Inside, there was no pile of cash, no dramatic treasure, just a neatly organized stack of documents and a single envelope placed on top, her name written across it in Harold's familiar handwriting. Evelyn reached for it first, her fingers trembling slightly as she opened it, her breath catching the moment she began to read. "Evelyn, if you're reading this, then you found it, and that means you didn't walk away." Her chest tightened instantly. "I know what the will looked like. I know what it must have felt like. But I needed them to believe there was nothing left for you. Because if they knew the truth, they wouldn't have waited. They would have taken everything before you even had time to think." Evelyn lowered the paper for a second, her eyes filling, the pieces finally beginning to come together. She looked back at the room around her, the documents, the records, the life Harold had hidden, and then continued reading. "Everything here is yours. The properties, the accounts, the partnerships, I moved them quietly over the years. Not to hide them from you, but to protect them for you." A tear slipped down her cheek as she read the next line. "The trailer wasn't your inheritance. It was the door." Evelyn let out a soft, unsteady breath, her hand pressing lightly against the paper. "I needed to know that if everything looked like nothing, you would still look deeper. Because you always did." The letter ended simply. No long goodbye, just one final line. "Now you finally have what they never deserved." Silence filled the space as Evelyn lowered the letter, but it didn't feel empty anymore. It felt clear. For the first time since the will was read, since the laughter, since the quiet humiliation, everything made sense. Weeks later, when Daniel and Lisa realized the accounts they expected weren't accessible, when the assets they thought were theirs didn't exist the way they believed, they came looking for answers. But by then, it was already done. Every document had been processed, every transfer secured. Everything Harold had hidden was now legally, completely Evelyn's. When they finally stood in front of her, confusion turning to frustration, then anger, demanding to know what had happened, Evelyn didn't argue. She didn't explain everything. She simply looked at them, calm and steady, and said, "You thought he left me nothing." She paused, just long enough for the words to settle. "He just made sure you saw it that way." And as they stood there, realizing too late what they had lost, Evelyn felt something she hadn't felt in a long time. Not grief, not anger, not even revenge, but quiet certainty. Because the truth was never in what he left behind in plain sight. It was in what he trusted her to find.